like physics, philosophy, is or should be very, very fundamental. I mean, the difference is that in a way, whatever you might be interested in, if you take it down to the most fundamental level, it becomes kind of philosophy.
Hello, my geeslings. This is Mother Goose, Robinson Erhardt, with the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 78. And this episode is with a real bona fide sweetheart, Paul Horwich, who is professor of philosophy at NYU. And Paul has worked in a number of areas, many areas, which I often find myself saying because of how fortunate I am to have such esteemed guests. But Paul started off working in philosophy of physics and science, but has become especially well-known and very, very, very highly regarded for his work in the philosophy of language, particularly his work on truth and meaning. Naturally, he has books by the same name, Truth and Meaning, and also his writings on Wittgenstein's philosophy of language. And in this episode, Paul and I talk about the relationship between his early work on the philosophy of physics and his later work on truth and meaning, because I just found it fascinating as I was looking through his background that he started off his career investigating the minutia of the world on a physical level. And then later on in his career, he was researching the most abstract possible things. I suppose being might be more abstract than truth and meaning, but truth and meaning are still quite abstract. And after we recorded this, Paul visited Stanford. Not for me, of course. He was here to give a lecture, a very nice lecture on Wittgenstein, but we ended up going out to dinner, and he's just such a sweet guy, and I can't stress that enough. Now, I also have to mention that leaving reviews, likes, all of these things are endlessly appreciated. I would love it if you checked out my other channel, Robinson Eats, in which I eat a pint of ice cream every morning and talk with whoever is there, though I understand if that doesn't get you as excited as it gets me. And you should also, if you know Paul, if you're in New York, let him know how much you enjoyed this conversation. And without any further ado, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, as you will tell Paul you did, as much as I enjoyed having it with Paul. Paul,
Yeah,
you started out working in physics at Oxford, which I think of kind of as studying the world at its most nitty-gritty, granular detail. Yet then you've spent much of the past 30 years working on the philosophy of truth and meaning, which are essentially the most abstract ways you could possibly get at the world. And I found this trajectory very striking. So what is the sort of inquiry you see yourself as engaged in, or the way that you look at the world that connects these two seemingly very distant pursuits?
Well, let me start out by going back even further in time.
Please.
When I was younger, very young, young teenager, 12 or something like that. I got 13. I became very interested in chemistry. And I think it was because there was an very old friend, maybe distant relative of my father, my father came from Poland. And this guy came from Poland who was actually a scientist, a chemist. In fact, became a member of the Royal Society, very distinguished, one of the first people to work on polymers. And so I sort of got interested in that. And so I was one of these kids I don't know if they do it anymore, but I had chemistry sets where you have the materials to do kind of experiments, and and I used to just buy more stuff and really do make dangerous gases and have explosions at home. I used to make my own fireworks.
Oh,
And
that's so awesome.
always amazed me that you could, at my age as a child, I could go into the local pharmacy and they would sell me anything like concentrated sulfuric acid. I mean, very dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
The thing is, nowadays it would be unthinkable. But anyway, I was doing that and I love doing that. I mean, I'm probably lucky to have all my fingers still. But anyway, I did
Sounds
it.
like it.
So it was a no-brainer for me when I applied. As you probably know, in England, when you want to go to university, it's not like here where you go, you let in, and then you do various courses, and then eventually you declare a major. No, there you have to say from the get-go what you want to do when you apply. And then you are accepted. If you're accepted to do that thing, and only that thing. So, and I applied to do chemistry, and I was accepted to do chemistry. Okay, I thought, fine. But then there was a few months before the end of the school, and I'd been admitted, and when I'd actually start. So I somehow ended up, bizarrely, with a job working in a nuclear reactor in the north of England. And I don't know, I did some experiments. And somehow, for some reason, I just started to think, I am very interested in science. Chemistry is great, but physics is even more fundamental.
Right.
And so, that's the thing. And the physics and the mathematics, I thought, so I wrote to the college in Oxford, and I said, would it be okay? Could I possibly switch? When I come, could I do physics and something? And they said, okay. So that's what I did. Physics and mathematics. I had a physics tutor and a mathematics tutor. And that was good. But, the college had people, other kids, friends I became friends with who came the same year as me, doing different things. Some of them doing philosophy. And so, we would talk through the night as you do, and I would sort of thought, this is good stuff. But then the real settling thing was that I discovered there was something, a genuine subject called there was something called philosophy of science, and there was something called philosophy of physics even.
Right.
So, and I became somewhat captivated because, in fact, of course, even these days, sometimes the physics, is a bunch of equations, can be slightly frustrating. You want to know, well, what does that mean about the real structure of the world? What does Einstein mean if he says space is curved? What could that possibly be? And you've got quantum mechanics. Is the cat dead or alive? Somehow in some both in some sense. I mean, it's just, so you want, so I was thinking, really, so I resolved at some point that when I got my degree, I was going to move to physics. And simultaneously I resolved, but here I have no idea how it came to me. I certainly wasn't getting any advice from anyone. I thought I'm going to go to the US. So I happened to come across a brochure from the physics department at Yale saying that you could do philosophy of physics there. So I thought, well, that's ideal. After all, I'm going to get a physics degree. They might let me in, and then I will do what I want to do. So I filled out the forms. They let me in. They gave me a fellowship, and I thought, great. So I went over. I remember there was some big boat going from Southampton, full of students, I guess mostly Americans coming back from Europe after the summer, but also people like me, maybe. And I got there at Yale, and I had a meeting with the director of the graduate studies in the physics department, and I told him again what I wanted to do. He said, I'm sorry, you can't do that. He said, when when you reach the thesis writing stage, yes, then we have some people you could work with. But first of all, it's 2 years of coursework in physics. Those are the rules here. And I said, oh, God, I really don't want to do that, and he became so angry with me. I mean, almost brought me to tears. He accused me of getting my fellowship under false pretenses, which, in fact, was just ignorance and naivety. I know I wouldn't do such a thing deliberately. And so I had to do the physics in the first semester. And while I was there, I was sitting in on some classes in the philosophy department. And then in the second semester, they took me into the philosophy department. So I was finished with that physics. But the philosophy department was really not what it used to be there. It used to be a very distinguished department. They'd lost a lot of people to illness, deaths, retirements, people taking other jobs. And they'd only had things like the history of philosophy, or existentialism phenomena. So it wasn't the kind of rigorous kind of philosophy that that's more Anglo-American, in a way more like science. You have to be very clear. You have to give solid arguments for what you're claiming and so on. So I knew I wasn't settled. I had to go somewhere else. I had no idea, no advice. It was so random. You'll think it's stupid and ridiculous, but I just happened to be at some point when I'm trying to decide what to do, I was listening to a song by Simon and Garfunkel. And somehow in one of the lines of the song were the words Berkeley and Cornell. So I thought, oh, yeah, that sounds good. Why don't I fly to Berkeley and Cornell? And Berkeley never sent me back. I requested the forms, never got them back. Cornell sent me the forms for me to apply. I applied. They let me in. And I went there, and I was absolutely I was so happy to be there. I mean, Ithaca is a kind of a one-horse town. There's nothing to do, but I don't care about that. I was finally doing, immersed in the subject.
Philosophy of science.
Well, yeah, I had no interest, but in fact, I just swallowed up everything that was being taught, whatever it was, ethics, lots of things. In fact, the first publication I ever had was something I wrote, in the first semester, actually. It was about utilitarianism, ethics. So I was just I like the kind of thinking, because like physics, philosophy, is or should be very, very fundamental. I mean, the difference is that in a way, whatever you might be interested in, if you take it down to the most fundamental level, it becomes kind of philosophy. So it's good for a dilettante. I mean, you can really move around in the subject, as I have, So, when I left Cornell, I meant to go back to my own country, England, and there weren't any jobs. It was bad economics. I ended up getting a job at MIT, and I was hired to do philosophy of physics. And that's what I mainly taught there and philosophy of science. But then at some point, I just thought, started to branch out. And the good thing was the faculty felt that many of the graduate students were not being properly educated, or they didn't have the right kind of background. And there were certain things in philosophy that no matter what they wanted to specialize in, every graduate student in philosophy should have read blah, 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 a bunch of things. So they decided they were going to introduce, it's actually even done here these days. The model for it was how they did it at MIT. There would be something called the pro seminar.
Yeah, we have that here.
Required for all the first-year graduate students. And the way it was done there were 2 3-hour meetings a week. And we made their way through the literature. I mean, usually starting around Frege. So it wasn't real history, but still, it goes back 100 years or so. And I volunteered to do it, even though I knew nothing about those matters. But then I thought, I need to know something. And so I'm going to learn it alongside with, when I'm getting ready to teach the students. And so, and that's where, the ultimate origin of things like my interest in eventually
truth, meaning,
the nature of truth and meaning,
yeah.
and lots of other stuff. And I just continued that, wherever eventually I did get back to England and stayed at MIT for 22 years. And I liked it there very much. I mean, at the beginning, I thought, why am I in an institute of technology? I'm a philosopher, but then they had a great department of philosophy, and the institute is a very well-run place. So and I like Cambridge, Boston area. So nothing really was wrong with it. I just did think, you only live once, and I should see life in my own country. My mother was still alive. So I went to live in London. I got a job in London, which I also didn't know because I come from the north of England. But London is great. And I enjoyed being back in England. It was, but I only came back to the US because they had these very strict, retirement laws at the age of 65. It's thank you very much, go home. I didn't fancy that. So I actually first came to City University of New York, the Graduate Center, and then, some years later moved to NYU.
So you said that this really jumped out at me. Like physics, philosophy should be fundamental. And so on the one hand, you were studying physics, sort of how I initially framed this question. You were studying physics, which gets at the world in a very fundamental sense. Yeah. And then on the other hand, truth and meaning are very fundamental. But do you think of them as maybe getting at language, or what is it that you are studying truth and meaning in reference to?
Well, I think the process for me was, beginning, say, with philosophy of science. So philosophy of science is obviously you're trying to make discoveries. What are the fundamental laws? What explains what? And I remember. So So there are, of course, interesting issues. What exactly is the method of science, and why? How does it manage to make these discoveries? I mean, why does it have the authority it does, and how come it works so well? So. But I remember, I think it was when I was maybe still at MIT. I don't remember now exactly, but a book came out that took people by storm a bit by a guy called Bas van Fraassen at Princeton, and he made a strong argument. It's called anti-realism, that you cannot get at the truth. The scientific method is not going to give you the truth. And he has an argument, basically, roughly speaking, the nub of it, I mean, going a bit fast, but that if you've got a theory, a physical theory, and it, explains all the data, fits the data perfectly, predicts things, everything. He argued that whenever you have such a theory, you could always contrive another one that would do it just as well. So it would be just as well supported as the first one. So how could you could be unreasonable to just pick one rather than another, which you can't tell which one is the true one. So you have to just give up on the idea that truth is, a value here, and you should be trying to pursue the truth.
How is it that you create a second theory that perfectly fits the data as well? You just sort of append some sort of like vacuous statement to it, or?
No, well, I don't think that would be if you did that wouldn't be very convincing.
Right.
I think he had some examples of things where, I mean, like I think one of these examples came from out of Einstein and the general theory that, you could have, you could hang on to Euclidean geometry, and then you'd have a certain physical theory, and together they would explain things, would explain everything. Or alternatively, you could use a different geometry, and that would actually enable you to have a simpler physics that would still explain everything the same. Everything would get explained. So it would seem these two, people used to say, empirically equivalent. And other people, Quine had some essay about empirically equivalent theories. And so anyway, that kind of led me to, of course, it's an interesting question anyway. I mean, it sounds deep, and it is deep, What is truth?
Mm-hmm.
It's a property and some beliefs have it, other beliefs don't have it. So what is it? I mean, we can ask that kind of question about all sorts of things. Some things are magnetic, some things are not. What's the difference? What is it that makes something magnetic? So what is it that makes something true? And of course, and the history of philosophy is full of, tons of attempts to say what it is to be true, give a kind of definition of the word true, and there are all these, but when you look at them, they all have some problems. And so just became an interest in itself, just free of what the utility of it would be. Just what is the answer to that question, And so, I just, yeah.
So the way that von Frossen was talking about truth, in the sense that a science might not get at the truth, it doesn't sound like he was talking about truth as a predicate to me, or a property.
Well,
seems like it was like a metaphysical sort of thing.
Well, but I mean, no, I think, of course, a predicate, that's a part of speech. There are nouns, there are predicates. So is true, that's a predicate. And nothing you can do about that. I mean, it is. I mean, but grammar, it's a matter of grammar. You say a certain belief, this entity is true, or this statement is not true, or, that's a predicate. Now, whether there's a property there, well, I think it's only, relatively recently, with maybe coming along partly alongside with deflationism, or people who are the beginning of that movement who would have said, well, maybe it's not a property, it's just some word that we do, blah, blah, blah. I'm not myself, I don't find myself interested in that. I mean, I just don't regard it as a sharp, I'm myself, and this is, I guess, a more of a Fregean idea. I'm inclined to think that, in a way, we identify a property as something that a predicate stands for, whereas an object is something that a name or a definite descriptions. So you have nominal expressions, and if they stand for anything at all, they're things of some kind, right. Objects of some kind. Similarly, predicate, if it designates anything at all, it designates a property.
Which is why getting at the truth, the truth is treated sort of as a name that designates an object.
Well, the truth, it sounds a funny expression. I know it's commonly used, but when you say the truth, of course, there is no just thinking one thing, which is the truth. There's the question of whether such and such a thing is true. What's the truth of the matter concerning blah, 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 whether such and such is the case. So there's it's truth is the name of the property, and you can ask, does that statement have the property or not?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, what does it having it consist in?
Mm-hmm.
And the definitions are supposed to say, I'm telling you, what is it for that thing to be true? And of course, the classical answer that was, regarded as obviously correct for many, many, many years, a large part of the history of this discussion was that truth is a matter of corresponding to a fact. That's the property. The thing corresponds to a fact. It's true, and that's what truth is: being in correspondence with a fact. But there were, when people started to get skeptical about that, even in the earlier 20th century, the Vienna Circle, yeah, if you want to give a definition, you have to use words that we already understand. So are you saying it's unproblematic then what a fact is? Well, that sounds a bit fishy. It doesn't sound any less mysterious than the word truth itself. Or corresponds, what's that? So nobody ever defined corresponds, nobody ever defined fact. And so it was thought to be unsatisfactory. So then you got things like, more epistemological definitions, like, like truth as provability. Something is true if you can establish it's true. If you have if you can establish it. If you've got the, uncontrovertible evidence that tells you have to believe that. That would be what truth is, according to some views, the later views. And it didn't seem to be as metaphysical as the ones that were, but there are objections to all of those, all the definite. Then there was a kind of pragmatist theory of truth, so that William James, I think, William James, what the truth is what's pragmatically valuable to believe. And, but they all can be, they're all either circular or they're, counterexamples can be found. And so I just became, what I liked, since I'd actually started out on this kind of non-physics stuff by reading Frege, I remember Frege addressing in his famous paper, on sense and reference, saying something about, in a way, true. He says that, the proposition that it's true that snow is white is exactly the same as the proposition that snow is white. So when you say of a proposition that it's true, that second proposition, if you like, the one which attributes truth to the first one, actually you end up with exactly the same proposition you had to begin with. So it's sometimes called the redundancy theory of truth. So I think that was as I know, the first account of truth that, one might reasonably say was the beginning of deflationism about truth. But, so then there are different ideas. And my own proposal was, not 100 miles from that, not a million miles from that kind of Fregean idea, except his idea that it was exactly the same thing. The proposition that blah, 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 and the proposition that blah, blah, blah is true, no difference between them, just seems wrong. I mean, one of them has the concept of truth in it and the other one doesn't. So how could they be exactly the same proposition, which is presumably a proposition is something that combines different concepts, or a certain combination of concepts. But if one proposition has a certain concept in it and the other one doesn't, then how could they be the same? So I thought that was going too far, but I thought there was something to it. And I think what is right is that just everyone would agree that the proposition that there's life on Mars, for example, is true if there is life on Mars, and it is only true if there is life on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, the proposition that lying is wrong is true if lying is wrong, and only if lying is wrong, and so on and so on and so on. It does not matter what, sentence of English you put in, as long as it's a statement, not a question or something like that. That equivalence holds. So I called it the equivalence, the truth schema, the equivalence schema, so that, to put it schematically, to say of the proposition, to attribute truth, the proposition that attributes truth to the proposition that P, so it's, I'll put it this way. The proposition that P is true if and only if P, could put it that way. That schema, it doesn't matter what you put for P, the proposition that P is true if and only if P. We had some examples of that. So there are no counterexamples to that. So that's the idea is that, and this exploits Wittgenstein's views to some extent, that, we were looking for the meaning of the word true. It was always a giant mistake to think that its meaning came from a definition. In fact, very few words of ours their meanings, do they come from a definition? I mean, one might naively at the beginning, before you really spend a lot of time thinking about it, somebody might think, well, surely every word has its meaning because of how it's defined. But of course, that can't be right because, you get an infinite regress because you have this and it's defined in terms of these things. Oh, well, these have to have a meaning. So they're defined in terms of something more basic. Yeah, but then those, so you'd go on.
Right.
So it's obviously untenable. It can't be,
you have to have primitives if you
it wouldn't bottom out. So you have to have some, and why not many, words that get their meaning in some other way. And Wittgenstein's idea in the investigations was that the meaning of a word is a matter of how it's used. There's some kind of regularity or rule in the language, about a basic rule about how this word is used. And that's what gives it its meaning. So in the case of the word true, you could say, well, what constitutes somebody's understanding the word true, using that word with its meaning, is they're accepting this equivalence I just mentioned. So whatever it is, if they accept that the proposition, whatever P is, if they accept that the proposition that P is true, if and only if P itself, then that's going to be the fundamental rule that explains everything else you do with a word. And that remains. I mean, actually, it's become perhaps the dominant view. So I'm quite proud of it. And, probably it's my most successful piece of work. But, it really did rely on Wittgenstein's views about the relationship between meaning and use. And then also the work I did on meaning is very influenced by that idea of trying to make it spell it, flesh it out a bit. What does that mean? The meaning of a word is its use. What does he mean by use? And I mean, just trying to make it a bit more, clear
Mm-hmm.
and plausible. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we got into this discussion of truth through von Frausen's anti-realism, and I think we're going to get back to truth. But what then is scientific realism, since we've talked about anti-realism?
Well, I mean, it's, of course, philosophers, it's all due to Dummett, actually. He started all this problem. But I mean, he's the one who now started making a big fuss about domains. Well, are you a realist or you're an anti-realist? And so now, these days, everyone, whatever branch of philosophy they're interested in, whether it's ethics or philosophy of mathematics or whatever it is, or science or aesthetics, whatever it is, people want to say, I'm a realist about that, or I'm an anti-realist about that, and so it became a thing. And, but actually, one of the issues, I think one thing one has to recognize is that what counts as a realist or an anti-realist in a given domain may not really bear that much resemblance to what the dispute is between realists and anti-realists in other domains. So when people talk about scientific realism or anti-realism, I guess they do have in mind Van Fraassen. And for him, he didn't use the word anti-realism. It was, I think, more like instrumentalism. But still, that would count as, and, but in other domains, it's not necessarily parallel, that there is something called instrumentalism. I mean, one way of being an anti-realist, for instance, in ethics, is to say, well, there simply aren't any absolute ethical facts. That is, that such and such is good, such and such way of treating people, is bad. You ought to do this, you ought to do that. You ought not to tell lies. That nothing is absolutely good or bad or right or wrong. Everything ought to be done. The most you can say is it's relativism. The most you can say is, well, things are right or wrong relative to some moral perspective. And it could be right relative to this perspective and wrong relative to this other perspective. And so, there are, relativists about ethics. And I think Gilbert Harman, was somebody who pushed that. And so, of course, that's a kind of anti-realism, because actually, and this is, my colleague Paul Boghossian has done a lot to get people to see this, that the kind of relativized statements, such and such is wrong relative to such and such a framework, is not even really a statement of ethics anymore. Because what is a framework? A framework is just some collection of moral propositions. So the fact that lying is wrong relative to such and such a bunch of moral propositions is trivial. It's really just an entailment statement. And there's nothing normative about it at all. It doesn't tell you what you should do or what you shouldn't do. It just says, well, if this is wrong, then this is wrong. So what? That's not very interesting. So it's not the best. There are other forms of anti-realism in arithmetic, in ethics. Another my colleague Sharon Street has argued that what a given person, the sort of ethical facts, and what a given person should do, or is obliged to do, or so on, is obliged not to do, is constituted in some way by what that person believes that they ought to do. So, on her view, you take all of a person's ethical beliefs and you, in some ways, idealize. You kind of got away with, you try and eliminate the contradictions and you make it more coherent. And then that will be what, the facts that morally, relative to that, with that person, what that person ought to do. And so it's called constructivism. So that's also, because one of the, be somewhat mysterious ways of identifying anti-realism is that it's, some kind of, one is an anti-realist about certain kinds of fact if one thinks that those facts are mind-dependent, So there's this term thrown around, some things are mind-independent, constructed by us, made up by us. They're not really out there independently of us. Such and such is a social construct. One hears that all the time, So, yeah. And of course in aesthetics you have another, even that's probably more palatable to people, that aesthetics you be anti-realist with aesthetics than be an anti-realist about morality, because most people do hang on to having actual ethical beliefs. They do think, no, that's simply wrong,
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't hurt people for your own amusement. And I don't know, lots of things seem to. Whereas with aesthetics, whether something is beautiful or not, that kind of thing, you think, well, it doesn't seem so crazy to say, well, when somebody says that, all they're really saying is that they like it.
Right.
So that's the anti-realist thing. It's not. So in different areas, I think, and then in arithmetic, I guess there maybe isn't so far from the scientific case. My colleague Hartree-Field, I forget how long a time ago it was, in the 80s, wrote a book called Science Without Numbers. And because he didn't believe that there was such a thing as the number 3. Numbers as entities out there,
Right.
I don't like this. I don't go along with this way of talking. I don't like it. But, people talk about, that would be spooky. It would be weird if there were these things, they're not in space and time. They don't have any causal relations to anything, or they're not causes or effects of anything. And yet they're really things, they're entities, they're objects. No, that's all mystery. They say, no, we have to, it's sometimes called naturalism. You have to get rid of all that, So the question was then, how can we somehow, we can't really deny that arithmetic is useful in science somehow. So how can we have our cake and eat it? That is, somehow not throw away the utility and yet somehow manage to say literally there aren't any such things. And so it's quite ingenious, but it's a bit like with Van Fraassen. He wants to say, look, you can still do science And of course, it's useful, and you can, you do in exactly the same way as before. You deploy the scientific method in exactly the same way as before to try and, but and Van Fraassen, he says, look, the only big difference is that in the end, when you've got something that, fits all the data and everything out, you can't say, okay, we got the truth. You just have to say, well, we've got something that's empirically adequate. It's going to predict everything we want to predict. It's going to do, it's going to have the kind of utility of a terrifically true theory, but we're not going to take that step. We don't need to take it. And but it's kind of interesting, that variation from domain to domain. But I've sometimes thought, while I'm doing this seminar, that it feels a kind of, I feel, what's the right word for it? Somehow in the wrong. I feel like somehow I'm not being honest, because why would I give a seminar, on that topic? Because I myself think that this obsession that philosophers have with these terms, realism and anti-realism, and labeling themselves or labeling different people in that way, is just a huge error.
Oh, really?
And that jokingly, I think I even wrote this in a paper, that any philosopher caught using these words should be drummed out of the APA.
Wow.
Because I just think it doesn't, first of all, philosopherese has never settled on any definite meaning. So the result is it's all over the place, how different philosophers use it. So there is no meaning it has in the language, even the language of philosophers. So, people mean different things by it. And so the arguments are really, they're all at cross purposes, and it's all just causes confusion. It doesn't do any good at all. And then it leads to further, pseudo problems, which is then, okay, what is the best way to define realism then? As if there is a correct way. You've got a bunch of different definitions. Definitions aren't correct, or, definitions, especially of a jargon term, you're allowed to say what it means. So it's not a question of finding the right one. It's a matter of, you could say it's a matter of finding one that everyone would agree to go by. And, but even then, it just seems pointless to me. I think because in a lot of these areas, take ethics as an example, there are real problems. What does the word ought, as used in ethics, mean? So there are questions about meaning and semantics. There are questions about metaphysics. Are there facts about what's right and wrong, absolute facts, and what is the nature of such facts, if there are such facts? And then there are questions in epistemology. Do we have some methodology for discovering, what moral beliefs we should have and which ones we shouldn't have? And suppose we don't. What should we do? So these are, I think, genuine questions. And somebody looking at a certain collection of answers might say, oh, that makes you a realist, or that makes you an anti-realist. And I'd say, well, I don't know, whatever you want. I don't care. The important thing is the answer to those questions, not slapping some other label on it. And over there, where there's a huge difference of opinion between people as to when that label should be applied. Just stay closer to the ground and say, okay, what are the answers to the obviously genuine questions that arise in this area? Genuine puzzles. No need to summarize it or to try and summarize it in a way, especially when it's not nobody's really going to understand what, everyone is going to have a different view about what you're actually saying when you're summarizing it using those words. So I just think they do more harm than good.
In the case of mathematics, you said that you didn't go along with this way of speaking when people say, oh, abstract objects, Platonic objects, they're spooky, they don't like them.
Yeah,
And I think I'm correct in guessing that you don't really like the idea of this naturalist program. Is that?
that's right. That's true. Yeah, I think that's kind of too scientistic, if you put it that way. Uh, Science doesn't determine everything we should believe. I mean, ethics is an example. I mean, do we really look to scientists to tell us, to give us even the slightest insight about what the moral facts are? I mean, there are lots, so science is not the be all and end all. And, I think the fact is there is a way we ordinarily use the word exists. And I don't think there's any reason for changing it. There are, there are some of those. There exist, somebody might say, is there a prime number between this and that? And you think about it and say, yes, there is one. There exists a prime number. Okay, so, and if there doesn't exist any numbers at all, how could there be any prime numbers? So I just don't see anything. It just seems the most normal thing to me to say, I mean, not to have some principle because the thing isn't floating around somewhere, you might bump into it, that nothing could exist except that kind of thing. I mean, there are lots of things that we talk about that exist. I mean, not just there is a number satisfying these conditions, but, I don't know, possibilities. There are some things are actual, and some things are merely possible. So you might say of something which not actual. Well, it's there was a possibility that the sun have 10 planets. So okay, so we talk about there exist certain possibilities, and so that's another abstract thing. But on that accord, there's no reason why we should not, to my view, just say, okay, and I'm sure that one can just come up with lots of examples of what appear to be things where we have nominal expressions to pick them out. We use names or, there's a name for it, it might not, where and we believe that, we have a use for, we think we would say ordinarily they exist, but they're abstract. They're not made of concrete stuff. So, I think there's just somehow nothing to be gained. I mean, I think that people who think there's something to be gained see it as a kind of metaphysical simplification to get rid of them, But, I don't. Yeah.
Now, You said that we don't turn to scientists for answer when you were talking about problems with scientism and naturalism. You said that we don't turn to scientists for answers about moral facts, and I think that's likely because scientists, at least when they're wearing their scientist hats, probably don't treat the world as if it contains such things as moral facts. But
Well,
I take it that
it might be. I'm sorry. I don't. I think a scientist could be an extremely moral person, so have moral convictions. I mean,
mm,
I don't see why, like everybody else, the things you think people should do and things people shouldn't do to each other, people should do to, people should care about the welfare of others to some extent, or they shouldn't do this, and I don't think there's any reason to think a scientist is going to be any less moral than a philosopher or a doctor
right.
or anybody else for that matter, or a priest, anyone.
hmm But I take it that you think that there are moral facts for the same reason that you would say that there are prime numbers between there's one between 1 and 5 or two between 1 and 5, just because that's our ordinary way of using
Yeah,
the existing.
I mean, one thing, yeah, I think you're getting at is that I think anyone who has, moral beliefs, anyone who say believes that lying is wrong. I mean, prima facie, not that it can't be overwhelmed somehow by other things sometimes. So it doesn't mean in any circumstances, but but before you get to further detail, on the face of it, yeah, it's wrong. It should be avoided. And I think anyone who believes that, what is it to believe something? To believe something, well, the something is a proposition, is to regard the proposition as true. That's what it is to believe something. To believe
Mhm.
something and to believe that the thing is true, it means the same thing. But a fact is nothing more than a proposition that's true. So you can't have beliefs in things and yet somehow, say, oh, I don't think there are any facts, of course. I just believe, I mean, unless you have some very weird conception of what a fact is.
Sure.
I don't see, I think, yeah, so I think, although there are arguments, in the literature that are against um, moral facts, I think they all go wrong. They just, make mistakes. So, and, but I think certainly ordinary people who do have beliefs about moral matters, they are committed, whether they know it or not, to the existence of moral facts. They maybe don't put it that way.
hmm Now, one reason why somebody, to play devil's advocate, might not think that there are moral facts might go something like this. I mean, we think that there are physical facts about, I don't know, the electrons that make up this computer because there's some agreed upon objective way that we might go about investigating it through experimentation or observation to determine what the laptop is made up of. But I don't know how we could determine whether or not lying is wrong truly is a fact, the way that we
Yeah,
could determine that this laptop is made up of atoms is a fact.
yeah. Well, I mean, that line of thought is quite similar to something I mentioned earlier on when I was saying, well, there were people who found the famous, traditional correspondence theory of truth to be, too metaphysical and not really clear what the terms mean, correspondence. And so what became more popular were epistemological theories, so which identify, say, truth or facts with what can be verified. So, yeah, if you have that notion of truth and fact, that in order to be true, well, it's in order to be true something has to be establishable, verifiable, provable, then you might lead you to say, well, I'm not sure there are any facts. But but if you think that it seems intuitively perfectly, doesn't seem to be any contradiction in the very idea that we take something to be true and we believe it, but we haven't verified. We haven't. I mean, something could be out there, a fact, and we haven't discovered it yet, and maybe we never will. I mean, isn't that perfectly coherent? That something be true, and not just that nobody's actually has, proven that it's true, or whatever the non-mathematical equivalent of proving it is. I mean, coming out with a really very, very powerful, compelling evidence or reasons for thinking that it's true that make you completely convinced that, So there surely are things that, we wouldn't call it discovery if we'd already, there was something we could suspect that it was true, we could believe it, but say we haven't had, absolutely ultimate confirmation. For instance, let me give an example from mathematics, I guess. There are these things, maybe what I'm saying is out of date. What's that? Is it Goldbach's conjecture? Yeah, Goldbach's conjecture. Every even number is the sum of two prime numbers. Okay. Nobody's been able to prove that. Nobody's ever shown that it's false either. But it's been fed into giant computer mainframes, and they've tested it up to gazillions and gazillions, and they never found a counterexample. So many people would say, well, look, surely it's true, but we don't have the proof of it. Wouldn't it be amazing if we checked it up to billions and billions and, but somehow, off, way out in numerical space, there is a counterexample. But even, so it's, but of course in the physical world, that's even in a way more obvious. There's stuff happening in the universe a hell of a long way from here. Presumably there are facts. Mm-hmm. We have no idea what they are.
But those are in principle verifiable.
They don't become facts only when we've somehow come to recognize them. Facts for us. The facts were there waiting to be discovered. And, that's obviously one could think of lots of examples like that, It's the fact that the Earth is spherical, not flat, okay? But it was a fact well before, people started believing that it was. Eventually became verified, but certainly wasn't at the time when, for a long, while it was there, so I think that, that we should just keep to the idea of a fact as a true proposition, and recognize that something can be true. Just going back to the deflationary view that I mentioned, my version of it, that we're always going to accept the proposition that P is true, if and only if P, whatever we put in for P. There's nothing in that, if that's really the key to the meaning, the essence of the meaning of the true, there's nothing there to suggest that, oh, there's a further thing that has to be the case to count as true in terms of verification. There's no indication of that at all. It's got nothing, truth is a much simpler concept than that, involving provability or anything like that. It just doesn't enter into it.
I guess I'm stumped then on how to continue pushing back, because what I wanted to push back against was, take lying is wrong. I was going to ask, what are some alternative ways that we could determine whether or not this proposition is a fact if we can't verify it or we can't prove it? If we can't, how do we know something like lying is wrong is a fact if we don't have those options?
No, it's maybe we shouldn't say we know it.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't mean we can't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a gut feeling, people talk about, and I have some sympathy for this, moral intuitions. I think, one of the interesting things I think is important about, there was a doctrine about ethics popularized at the beginning of the 20th century, like positivists who say this, called emotivism. And emotivism was a very kind of radical view that when you come out with some kind of ethical claim, you say this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong, blah, 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 blah. This utterance that you make is nothing but an emotional outburst. It doesn't express a proposition. It can't be true or false. There can't be any such facts. You can't even do logical deductions from it. It doesn't have that kind of meaning. All it is thus, it's equivalent to saying, hooray for blah, 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 or, boo for so-and-so. In fact, it was sometimes called the hooray boo theory. So that's all you were doing. You were just emoting when you come out with these things. You're not really saying anything, expressing a belief. There are no beliefs. There are no beliefs. There are no propositions. There are no facts. There's no truth. There's just this expression of feeling. And so I think that that's going too far. But there is an important insight in there, I think, which should be preserved, not the whole thing thrown away. That there is a kind of a connection, a non-trivial connection between what you're convinced of, morally speaking, and how you feel about things, and whether if you come across or hear of or see a certain way of treating other people that really makes you sick, you just have a complete revulsion, that's a feeling, then you are going to think and say that's bad. So I think that is in a way the origin, rather than some methodology, that's the origin of gut moral beliefs, moral intuitions. They found it in, and I think people doing ethics think that they in some way have a role which is kind of parallel to the observation reports in science, and then you build on top of those. So here you start out with these gut things, if something, on the other hand, if you're convinced that a certain thing ought to be done, then going along with that intrinsically will be an inclination to do it. So there are these connections between this kind of normative language and what you're inclined to do, how you feel. And I think that's really the way in. Now, that doesn't mean that in the end you can get to knowledge. I mean, because individuals will have these moral intuitions and connected to the way certain things make them feel, either feel bad or feel good, and gives them a sense of approval or disapproval. So they have normative beliefs, but they're not going to ever really be objective, because it's everybody knows how much disagreement there is. Even in the ground level, it's not like science. In the science, when the observation claims are made by one scientist, oh, the needle is pointing at the number 3 on this dial. Well, everybody else would agree with that as well. So they're not controversial. Whereas these so-called moral intuitions, well, some people say yes, other people say, no, I don't agree with that. They have a different feeling when they see those things. So you're not going to get anything like, in the end, a methodology for discovering things that people can all get around. And now we know this. It's not, in that ways, it's not at all like science.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not going to be, but still, it's an important phenomenon. I mean, I think, so I don't think we should care that much whether people's moral beliefs are true or not. Because I don't think anything hinges on whether somebody's moral beliefs are true or not true. What matters is not whether their beliefs are true or not true, or whether your beliefs are true or not true. What matters is that you're having those beliefs, because it's your having those beliefs that's going to determine what you do. And whether the beliefs are true or not is not going to make a damn difference to anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different from the empirical case, of course, where, if you act partly on a belief, if I believe, if I want a beer and I believe there's beer in the fridge, then okay, I'm going to go to the fridge to get the thing out. So, and it matters if it turns out the belief was false and there isn't one there, So things go wrong in practical decision making. But in the case of moral beliefs, there is no downside to the beliefs being false rather than true, because all the only effect the belief has is on what it's an important thing is that the person is led to do things by their beliefs. And so you can quite rightly care what beliefs people have and wish they didn't have that belief because it's going to do something bad, lead to something bad or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But truth is not important and knowledge is not important. Just simply doesn't matter.
Well, I hope that you'll humor me with one last question on this topic, because I am still trying to understand just what a moral fact is, though. And so we can imagine an alternative history in which maybe humans evolved to be really cutthroat individuals, and they don't live in societies like ours where it really is good and useful to lie. And so to use your language, they really have a gut feeling and intuition that makes them believe it is right to lie to the same degree that we believe that it's wrong to lie, simpliciter. And surely, if lying is wrong corresponds potentially to a fact, then lying is right can't also be a fact. And
Yeah.
Maybe you're adopting a sort of Williamsonian epistemicism regarding the moral facts. Like there is one of these two, us or that we or them are correct, and we just have no way of knowing it. One of them does correspond to a fact.
Yeah.
Is that accurate, or is that how you view it?
Well, yeah, I guess so. I do think, it's, let me just think. Is that what I think? Um, uh, yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I do. I don't see any particular paradox or something where one's so deep that one has to give up the law of excluded middle, either P or not P for whatever you put in for P. So yeah, so either it's wrong or it's not. And okay, so but having a really justified view on that matter, especially one that would, in the end amount to knowledge, is impossible. So, but yeah, I think that's fine. It can be. All you're saying is either P or not P. You're not saying I know which one is the right one, or I could even know. It's yeah. So I guess I agree. I am driven to say that.
Okay, interesting. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. This has been a huge pleasure on my behalf.
I've enjoyed it. You've made it enjoyable. Thank you.
Hold on, Geeslings. Before you go, please like, subscribe, follow if you haven't already. Smash all those buttons. And also, if you haven't followed me on Twitter at Robinson Erhardt, or if you're not joining me every morning as I eat my pint of ice cream on Twitch at Robinson Erhardt on Robinson Eats, please do so.